And I'm so happy to be here. I wish I could be with you in person, hopefully next time at a subsequent workshop. So within this framework of metadata principles and common vocabularies and ontology for spatial history, I would like to focus today on how I think about those questions relative to my World Historical Gazetteer project, but also more generally, starting with some kind of theoretical musings about what space and place are, how to think historically about space and place, how to think multivocally and decolonially about space and place, and how to use spatial modeling and spatial metadata to achieve some of these goals. Some of the things I'm going to say in these sort of first kind of theoretical minutes might be very familiar to all of you, but I like to start with that. I really always, when I talk about spatial metadata, spatial modeling, and gazetteers, I always want to think first about what we're talking about when we talk about place. And I like starting with this definition from John Agnew that a place has a location, a place has some label, and it is a setting for events. And of course, we know from people, cultural geographers like Yifu Tuan, the number of places in the world can be infinite, right? A nation can be a place, your fireplace in your home can be a place, so long as it has these kinds of characteristics. And I like to start with a couple of these stories that have been in the news within the last year. On the left is this story about a Belgian farmer who accidentally moved the French border. And this is a story from the BBC that a farmer in Belgium was plowing his field. He came across this border marker. It was blocking his way. And so he moved it. And a local historian noticed that this stone border marker had moved. And what's interesting is that the last paragraph in this screenshot that I've captured here on this slide says, instead of causing international uproar, the incident has been met with smiles on both sides of the border. And of course, borders are not always like that, but this gives you an idea. This border marker absolutely had a location. It got moved from a correct location to a wrong location. It's a setting for event. The border was a setting for which this event of movement occurred. It didn't have a label, right? This particular border marker. And so it did not sort of have the characteristic of seeming like a place to this farmer. And so this gives you the feeling of place being contested, place being historical, place being subject to eventfulness and movement. On the right, my hometown of Pittsburgh, you can see an image here of a statue of Christopher Columbus located in a prominent place near the University of Pittsburgh campus that the city has decided after popular protest to decommission. We do not want to have this statue representing who we are as a city in the context of changing ideas about colonialism, who should be marked with public statues, and so on. And so it has now been tented in plastic. The marker has been removed, and so it has lost its standing as a place. There's still a location. It still has a physical object located there. It has been a setting for plenty of events, this event of decommissioning, but it is no longer labeled as a place. And so this just starts to get a feeling of place being complex, contested, and the idea that metadata, ontologies, and models about place, in order to be useful for representing history, need to take these kinds of complexities into account. Some of the other starting points that I think about when I think about place are from some of the other theorists I've named here. Tim Ingold, an anthropologist who has the concept of taskscapes, that place gets created through people engaging in activity at that location. It's sort of reiterating the idea that the eventfulness of place is as important as the location. David Turnbull, whose book I have an image here on the right-hand side of the slide, uses the concept of indexicality. And what he means by indexicality is that a map, he's more interested in maps than in place per se, but the idea that place and maps make meaning only for the people to whom they make meaning. There is nothing universal about place or about a map. And so from the point of, and of course, the example I gave earlier about the French border is a good example of that. A local historian knew that marker was supposed to make meaning in a particular way. The farmer whose field it was located in did not know that. That's a perfect example of what Turnbull is talking about with indexicality. And this also, from the point of view of metadata and modeling, really points towards the idea that it's important not just to assert that a place exists, to model the existence of a place, but also at the same time to make sure that we think of it, and this is a word I'm sure I'll be saying a lot over the rest of this talk, that we think of it as an attestation. And what I mean by attestation is really linked towards this idea of indexicality, the idea that for some person, some place makes meaning in some way. For some person, or according to some historical source, something is a place, or a place has a particular name. And so making sure that that kind of notion of attestation and multivocality is connected to place is absolutely essential, I think, when thinking about these questions about metadata and modeling. Another one of my sort of touch points in theory is from the geographer Michael Curry, who looks at the classical Greek history of thinking about space and place and introduces these three concepts: topos, koros, and geos. Koros is actually the oldest one, kind of in the sort of intellectual history of geographical thinking in the Greek tradition. And it's the idea that a place is a location on the Earth's surface that is connected astrologically to some point in the heavens, some asterism in the sky. And so a place is unique, it's individual, and it's fixed in place. The idea of topos comes along with storytelling. It's related to words like topology, topography, and is the idea that places are linked to each other in a narrative. Places don't make meaning individually. Places don't make meaning because they're sort of astrologically permanent. They make meaning because of their relationships to other places. Koros is the world of gazetteers. Topos is the world of itineraries. Geos, the latest one to emerge in an intellectual tradition, is the world of maps. And so as historians, we are so often really located in topos world and koros worlds. Those are the worlds of text, not map. And the reason why I care so much about gazetteers as forms of representing spatial knowledge is because they are the ones that very often best represent the world of text, the world of lists, and the worlds of stories. This is just an example of how places make meaning in relationship to one another. This is from the Turnbull book that introduces this concept of indexicality, and it is it's an indigenous North American map from the 17th century, depicting places in relationship to one another, places named with names that make meaning in connection to one another. And also, as you can see by the version of the whole map on the left, this is a really good representation of the fact that there's one form of places that are clearly meaning making, all of the circles connected with lines representing indigenous geopolitics, and then on the left, the settler world, the colonizer world, which is just sort of an undifferentiated kind of set of lines. And it gives you, again, this idea that some things are named, connected, made meaning as places, and others just aren't. And of course, this map would look very, very different from the colonizer point of view. And just one more example along those lines, this is the idea of places having multiple meanings, of the importance of using gazetteers and understanding naming practices for decolonizing purposes. And I'm going to be talking about a place here in the Gulf of Boothia. This is in northern Canada. And the story here is that Captain John Ross, 19th century British ship captain, was hired to make a map of the circumpolar world, which you see on the left. And he spent several years traveling around the Arctic to create this map. And of course, this means that any given place he stopped very briefly, just to basically create a map of the shoreline. And what I really like about this, the reason I like using this example is because of this watercolor painting that you can see on the upper right, which is a chronicle of Captain John Ross and his cartographer meeting with two of his native informants, Ikmalik and Tigashu, right? And he asked them sort of, where are we? Right, and used that for the purpose of making this sketch map of the Gulf of Boothia that you see on the bottom right, which ultimately is just about there, one tiny place in the entire circumpolar region, renamed with a British colonizer name rather than Ikmalik and Tigashu's names, and entrained into this new indexical world, this world of European knowledge rather than the world of local knowledge that it had represented before. Interestingly, there's now a project, this Coming Home to Indigenous Place Names in Canada project. Dr. Margaret Wickens Pierce in the University of Maine is now renaming or excavating the original names, the indigenous names of the places in Canada that are lost in a project like the Captain John Ross names. And once again, marked with an X here, is the Gulf of Boothia, right now with names that say things like the lake where the kakiak is used, or a place that has a large and pointing character, right? Or a place where you harvest materials for boot liners. It's sort of returning this locale to that sort of full sense of its eventfulness, its meaning making, this idea that it makes meaning as a taskscape, a place where people do things. And so this all just collectively gives you a sense of what is possible to do if you start with the idea of place and place names, and thinking from the point of view, I'm still sort of trying to remember that what we're talking about here is metadata and ontology, that these are the kinds of things that spatial metadata needs to be taken into account if the goal is to represent the complexity of human experience and the contested nature of place making, the idea that place makes different kinds of meanings for different people in the same location. Turning to one more, this is more from this kind of topos, this Koros notion of place, the idea that a place is a sort of a fixed thing. And this is from the Chinese local gazetteer, local encyclopedia tradition. And in China, historically, there have been about 6,000, 8,000 gazetteers created for counties, prefectures, individual temples, even villages in more modern times, but really especially for counties. And counties would get new gazetteers, new versions of these encyclopedias every number of years. It's a very, very interesting and rich historical tradition. And what I want to point out here is that this version, the 17th century version of the Gazetteer of Gaomi County, is a 19-chapter work. It includes many different It includes information about famous people. It includes information about commodities. It includes information about places located within the county. These are very sort of conventionalized works. But for the purpose of this question about what is place making, what I want to focus on here is that it takes one entire chapter just to determine, just to sort of textually describe where this place is and some of the subcategories. And that's that, I don't know if there are any Chinese readers in the crowd, but it's this Yi, chapter 1, Di Yu Zhi, the monograph about place, that has these several sort of subheadings. And the subheadings are information like the evolution of the unit over time. How has its borders changed? How have its parent-children relationship changed? The Xinye, its astrological setting, its boundaries, its topography, the mountains and rivers located within it, and so on. And so it's really, this just again sort of reinforces the complexity of place and the kinds of challenges, solvable challenges, I should say. I mean, this is a very, very highly structured work. There have been some really interesting experiments to use semi-automated methods actually to extract information from these Chinese gazetteers because they're so highly structured and they're so conventionalized. But that what a sort of a full-fledged ontology for a county in China would take into account is all of this kind of information that 17th century people thought was necessary to understanding where are you, right? Where is this location? Where's this locale? What is the setting for events? What are the names, right? And so all of this moving on to thinking about gazetteers as a genre, right? Lists of named places, which is the work of the World Historical Gazetteer. And I think the work of the project that you all are scoping is that historical gazetteers need to take all of this into account. And one of the ways to start with that, I think, is shorthand for thinking about everything that I've introduced so far is the idea that historical gazetteers describe events. That is, that they're not just lists of names and locations. They're not even just lists of names and locations and feature types. They're lists, they should be lists of placemaking events, right? What happened? Why did some place change its name from one to another? If a place changed its boundaries, why and when did that happen, right? How are places in those ways embedded in a social and human world? And just a couple of images here, a famous map of the Mississippi River showing all of the many courses that it has taken over time. That is, that the river is not just a line, it is an entire region of multiple courses, right? And rivers are so often things that we think of as being spatially simple. They're not, right? Even features in the landscape and terrain are never that simple. Poland, of course, a contemporary nation state that has come in and out of existence repeatedly, has had many different boundaries, right? A fully fledged gazetteer, an ontology for gazetteers should be able to accommodate all of this level of complexity. And then the third image here is a book that I co-edited a few years ago, came out in 2016, about historical gazetteers that covers much of the material that I've been talking about here today. So you can feel free to reference that book further, or I'd be happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. So what are some of the things you can do if you have a bunch of historical place names, not just one place name? And if you think of places as representing the eventfulness of history, not just being points on a map, arbitrary points on a map. And here I'm starting to turn to the World Historical Gazetteer, which I'll be talking about in the second half of this talk. And the search I did here, and welcome to the World Historical Gazetteer search screen, I searched for the term Santa, the Spanish word Santa, and came up with a list of dozens of hits in response to Santa, place names that include that text string that, as you can see, basically reflect the existence of Spanish global colonialism. So there are a lot of Santas in the Iberian Peninsula, a few it looks like elsewhere in Europe, a lot in Latin America, in Spanish Latin America, but not Portuguese Latin America. You see this just outlined on the map itself, and then also an outpost in the Philippines. And so even just from doing a text string search, you start to get a sense of this world of eventfulness and this world of meaning making. Beijing is another great example. This is the Wikipedia entry for the historical names of Beijing, including dozens of names, each of which, as you can see here in this sort of, mini kind of gloss after the name, is connected with a historical story, is connected with an act of placemaking. It's not simply just that these are strings of text, but that they're attestations, they come from historical sources, and they point to historical events. And so if we search for, and now I'm sort of pivoting to talking more about the World Historical Gazetteer, we don't yet have that level of complexity for the city of Beijing in the World of Historical Gazetteer. But if I search for Beijing, I receive a number of results. So a lot of different places that have been called Beijing. Some of them, if you look at the name variants, which include the term in Chinese characters, as well as in the Roman alphabet, pinyin, right, tells you more, if you can read it, about which kind of Beijings these are. Some of them are Beijing. There are multiple Beijings that have at different times been known as the Northern Capital. That's the translation of the term Beijing. There are also some other ones that mean different things. There are some that are what's it called? Wells, right? So it's some well in the north is the name of a village, and there are multiple villages with that version of Beijing. So in this case, I see that the first one has 6 links, that it's a populated place. And so if I click on that one and just following this red arrow here to the right side of the screen, what I see is that I have some temporal attestation, some information about when we have information about the existence of that particular Beijing. We have a cluster of points. If I were to zoom in, you would see here that this is not one single green dot. It's actually several places, but they're very, very close to each other, right? There's no need for multiple attestations to refer to the exact precise same latitude and longitude. And then most interestingly here, what you can see in this column on the left on this image of the right-hand side of the slide, if that makes sense, is that there are 6 or 8 different cards, and each of these is an attestation. Each of these comes from a different data set, from GeoNames, from the Getty Thesaurus of Geographical Names, from the Dorling-Kindersley Atlas, which we call Black, that's the name of the editor, several different references from that one atlas, including Beijing, Beiping, an alternate name that Beijing held during the Second World War, Khanbalik, the name that the city held when it was the capital of the Mongol Empire, Peking, right, from an earlier transliteration system, and so on. And then each of these, and you can see different feature types. So there's a Battle of Beijing with 6 linked records. There's a range of different settlements. There's at one time, it was a province, and so on. And then many variant names, also 104 alternate names for Beijing in GeoNames. And so this starts to get a sense of what we accomplish by thinking of each place record as being an attestation, not the absolute truth, but something that some source says is some piece of information. We cluster all of that together. Beijing is not one thing, it's the cluster of information, all of which is related to this place. Also with linked traces, I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. And then I can also expand any of these individual cards and get more information, links. This is all linked open data. And so being able then to connect out to the whole world of information of any of the sources that we've indexed here in the World Historical Gazetteer. So to step back a little bit and introduce the World Historical Gazetteer, this is a project that has been underway for about 5-6 years now, funded by the American National Endowment for the Humanities, by the Dutch Royal Humanities Institute, by several different centers at the University of Pittsburgh. We're currently seeking additional funding from the NEH. And the goal of the World Historical Gazetteer, as you can see here in our tagline, is to link knowledge about the past via place, with several different kinds of features. One is search, right? I'm just sort of looking through this sort of set of buttons on the left-hand side here, right, to be able to search and explore historical place data, which is what I just showed you, to be able to upload and extend your individual gazetteer. I'll talk about that a lot more over the next couple of slides, to link it to other places now or index and publish it, to use it for teaching, and to integrate it, well, to create collections, which I'll talk about also in a few minutes. And then, of course, we have an API if you want to integrate the index into any project of your own. I want to talk a little bit, I've talked about search already. I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation and publication, because I think that's really relevant to what your project is interested in, and also gets into some of these significant questions about ontology. And I want to start here with the diagram on the bottom left corner of the slide. This describes the process of contributing a gazetteer to our index, right? Essentially offering more attestations about place. So you can contribute either a CSV file or a JSON file. These are in our linked pasts format, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. You upload it to a database. We have both a database and a union index. When you upload it, it goes to the database. And you then go through a process of aligning and reconciling it against Wikidata and the Getty Thesaurus of Geographical Names. And this is a really powerful outcome sort of in and of itself, even if you don't go on to publish with the World Historical Gazetteer. If you have a name, maybe a modern country code, a feature type, ideally a location, ideally some IDs already from GeoNames, TGN, et cetera, then you sort of go through a semi-automated process. And I want to stress the significance of the fact that it's semi-automated. We offer suggestions. We don't actually say that two places are the same place from the point of view of a SCOS record, right? We suggest places that are potential close matches, but it's always up to the contributor and their judgment, right? Whether they want to assert that any place that we already know about is or is not a close match to their own contribution, right? That's not something that's about truth. It's something that's about whether the contributor thinks that two things make sense for a subsequent user to find and use together. If you accept that close match, then of course you can then you can add to your record, you can enhance your own contributed record to everything that we already know about that place. That's the reconciliation process. And then after reconciliation, then it can get accessioned into our union index with all of that enhanced information that just sort of creates more hooks and then it gets, and that process then links it to other places that we have already indexed. Of course, you can also download and walk away with your reconciled data, which has then been enhanced with alternate names, with links to other linked open data projects, with geometry, etc. What I'm showing here on the right-hand side of this slide is one example of what that reconciliation process looks like. So this is from a data set that includes a place called Marienborg. It's in the modern country of Poland. It has a couple of name variants. It has a date range when it existed, right? That's what the contributor submitted. And by going through, and I'll say a little bit more about what the reconciliation process entails in a minute, but through our first pass through reconciliation, right, we have this suggestion of a place called Malbork, right, also located in Poland, with some links to geonames, VIAF, Wikidata, etc. And we can see here on this thumbnail image that it's within about 1 kilometer. So it's up to the expert in Polish history to say whether they think that this modern place called Malbork is or is not a close match to Marienborg. If they want to accept it, they click on close match and they move on to the next one. We go through multiple passes in the reconciliation process. The first looks for authority identifiers in common that automatically link records. So if a contributor has a GeoNames ID and we know the same GeoNames ID, great, that's an automatic link. The next pass includes additional context, primary name, variant name, place types, modern countries, user-defined spatial areas, geometry, parent names, etc. And so, of course, as the subsequent passes go through, the matches are less and less likely to be good matches, one that a contributor would want to accept, but this is always in the hands of the contributor, is the point to stress, right? We at the World Historical Gazetteer don't make any editorial judgment whatsoever about whether a contributor name is or is not the same as something that we already know about. And here's an example of another contribution. This is from a pass 2 contribution, right, with a place where the contribution is Naiman, N-A-J-M-A-N. What we know about seems to be a place that's about 30 kilometers away in Cyrillic characters, same pronunciation, Naiman, but it is, right, both of the populated place from the contribution, a village from this Wikidata data ID, but it is up to a contributor to decide whether something 20 kilometers away with the same name is or is not an appropriate thing to establish as a close match. I want to also talk a little bit about, I see time is short, so I think I'll go through this fairly quickly, but just knowing that my task here is to talk about metadata and ontology. We've developed a format called the linked places format. And so this is the file format that we've developed for gazetteers. What I want to stress here, and this is that the goal is not to define one unified data model for gazetteers. Historical Gazetteer Research Project have whatever kind of multifarious form of ontology and metadata is appropriate to their own project. If I were trying to represent the world of these Chinese historical gazetteers, these Difangzhi, that encyclopedia that I showed you a few slides ago, I wouldn't want to limit myself to the linked past places format. It's not the most appropriate format for capturing all of that nuance, but it is a way of ensuring that there is enough uniformity to build links between different gazetteers, just enough additional metadata in order to make it possible to successfully complete a linked data project like the one that we have underway. And you can find more information about this on the World Historical Gazetteer website and some of the links out from it. And so this is just, I don't think anyone likes looking through this kind of code on a small screen during a presentation. You can find this in the documentation on the World Historical Gazetteer website, but just to sort of give you a sense that every record has to have a title. It has at least, right, it has one title. It can have one or more country codes. It can have multiple time spans. The time spans can be in years, or they can be in links to periodo names. It can have multiple names, multiple types, multiple geometries, multiple links, multiple relationships, for instance, to parent and children entities. These are all SCOS labels, of course, and descriptions out, links to more information about it. And so this is, again, this is just an example of a sort of fully worked linked places record. We can talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. We also you would want to use that full JSON format if you have a really complex gazetteer and you want to capture all of that complexity in a World Historical Gazetteer contribution, or at least some of that complexity. Of course, always for full complexity, you would want to link out to your own project website. This is just enough what we are looking for. And I guess I should reiterate this, that the point of view of the World Historical Gazetteer isn't to capture anybody's full project complexity. It's to be a reference work that captures this kind of multivocality of places, the idea that places can have multiple different attestations, that different experts can model information about places differently, and from there you can link out to your own project that has whatever format and whatever visualization and search tools and so on you have chosen to develop. For a more simple gazetteer contribution, rather than using the full linked places JSON format, we have this LPTSV format. And here we have a template file to download. And as you can see, it's very simple, just an ID, a title, a source of that information, start and end dates, an encouraged optional modern country code, optionally variants, optionally feature types, and then links to the AAT or other sources. Latitude and longitude are optional. If we know about a place that already exists, if you go through that reconciliation process, you can pick up latitude and longitude yourself. And that's one of the things that we think ultimately is going to be the most compelling use case for the World Historical Gazetteer, is that historical projects do not have to sort of laboriously and unaccurately go through the work of sort of each rediscovering again and again the latitude and longitude of places. We're also establishing collections. This is an instantiation of the linked traces format. And this is really, I talked earlier in my talk about how places make meaning in combination with each other. Places make meaning through events. And so we have two formats for building those kinds of relationships right now. This is actually our sort of current area of active development. One is a collection of data sets, which you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. And this is essentially intended, well, it has a couple of use cases, I think. One is intended for teams to work together. So these are our colleagues in the Netherlands who have 6 different collections related to Dutch global history. We have recently sort of stumbled into another use case, which is that we are digitizing an entire historical atlas. It's going to make sense for each individual atlas page to be its own data set, and yet all of those data sets can then be linked together using this data set collection tool. In addition to data set collections, we also have place connections, and this is something that we just made public last month. And the idea of a place collection is literally to create an itinerary, right? Or a thematic collection of places. So places along a route of travel, places associated with a given empire, places associated with an artistic movement, right? Places named in a novel. Anything like that can then be made into a place collection with an overall description, a link to a brief essay, quite simple metadata, and an annotation for each individual place in the collection that describes what its relationship is to the collection as a whole. And now when somebody searches for a place, they will also learn about what collections that place has been mentioned in. And that starts to get at this sense of meaning making and relationship that I started my remarks with. And then finally, we've developed a teaching page, and we have right now just sort of 8 simple curricula. But I think what I want to say about this here is simply that one of the things that we've learned as we've started working with teachers is that, at least in the United States, the idea of thinking about history and culture and meaning making through space and place, and through place names and the eventfulness of placemaking is not something that's really sort of common nature even to teachers, let alone to their students. And so our goal here is to create a collection of lesson plans that teachers can pick up and use themselves. They're very detailed, sort of full cookbooks for lessons, or to use as inspiration, just to think about what you can do if you start with this kind of spatial history methodology. And so with that, I have come to the end of my remarks. I just here want to acknowledge the team. Every time I have said we throughout this talk, I'm really speaking of myself and also Carl Grossner, who is the technical director. He is the person who has developed this entire platform. He has coded the whole platform. He has created and indexed and many of the data sets. He works closely with all of our contributors. And so I absolutely want to acknowledge him as the 100% co-equal person to me in this project, even though I'm the one named as the principal investigator. We have postdoctoral fellows, research associates, and advisory board, and we've been generously funded from a number of funders, and we just won an award recently as the best new tool or suite of tools from the Digital Humanities Awards last year. So with that, let me maybe unshare my screen so we can see each other, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much for an inspiring and uplifting talk. I'm sure there's lots of comments. Yeah.